Went down into the cabin to switch the batteries from 2 batteries to 1. It's just a safety measure to conserve power for restarting the engine when we're needing to head back down the channel into the dock. So I go down there to do that, and I turn the switch, and in my periphery, I see a light. And I look at the light, and it's the bilge light. Yeah, some boater said, uh-oh. So I see the bilge light, but the bilge switch is off. I want to instantly unsee that because I know what that means. That means the emergency float switch has activated. There's water coming in. We're taking on water. And so I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, Lord, you know what's wrong. I don't. Help us find it. So now time is the enemy because, it's a sailboat, right? You've got a 4,000-pound keel already pulling you down into the water. And now you're getting heavier because you're taking on water. Nobody wants that. So I quickly holler up to John, hey, turn it around. We're taking on water. I'm using as few words as possible because time is the enemy now. He says, okay, he does it. We head back toward the channel. We're about a mile offshore at this point. I go down there. I rip everything apart. I check all the through hulls. Nothing is amiss. I'm like, where is this coming from? I can tell it's coming from the stern. But I'm like, we didn't hit anything. What in the world? So all of my logic was used up. I didn't find the solution. So I trade places with John. I'm like, I'll take the boat down the channel. You go down there, see if you can figure out what's wrong. So he does, tears everything apart just like I did. He's like, Ruthie, there's so much water. I can't see what's wrong. By now, it's like ankle deep in the cabin. It's coming in fast. So the most sobering moment happens next when my husband of 40 years comes up holding our self-inflating life preservers, and he fixes a gaze on me, hands it to me, and it's a gaze that I don't often see in our 40 years of marriage, very serious. And he says to me, put it on, babe. Put it on. And I realize, wow, this is happening. We might end up at the bottom of the lake, or at least the boat will. We'll be floating, but hopefully somebody sees us. So we hail the Coast Guard, and it was an eerie feeling. For the first time, I'm hearing, we've heard other people hailing the Coast Guard when we're out, right? This time it's my voice. It's John's voice. We're asking them. We're saying Mayday. Not a good feeling. So out comes the Coast Guard, and honestly, the first time they came out, they flew by us. They missed us. So I'm like, hey, we're here. So they check with every boat along the way, and they finally get to us, but they raft up to us, and they take us back down the channel. They send guys on board. They're pumping the water out. And now I'm like, okay, I got to call the boatyard and beg for an emergency haul out because we got to get this thing out of the water or it's going to sink. So I do that, and the gal says, we don't have the sling truck driver here. So, and I said, well, plan B, because we're sinking. And she said, bring it over, and we'll do our best. We'll get pumps on board or whatever we can do. So by faith, I did that. I'm like, please, God, let the sling thing be there. And sure enough, it was. Little did I know that the receptionist was dating the sling truck driver. So she called in a favor, and out he came, and the next picture is what it looks like. That's our little boat, Soulmate, hauled out. See the slings? That's what you do. Now, I want you to notice on the stern, you can barely see it, but there's a hole right there, right? You see that? Right above the blue line. That's a cockpit drain hose. Does anybody know what happened? The cockpit drain hose, when you're at the dock, it's above the water line by this much. But when you're sailing and you're healed over on that, if there's any kind of hole in that hose between the floor, the sole of the cockpit, and the bottom of the boat in that hose, if there's any hole in that, once the pressure enters, you're going to take on water. So that was one problem. But there was another problem. This was the perfect storm, right? The other problem was the bilge pump failed. Well, the bilge pump itself didn't fail, but we had just replaced it, and because of the force of that thing turning on, trying to exit the water out of the boat, Ruthie evidently did not tighten the hose clamp enough. It blew the hose off. So all it was doing with all that water was circulating it. It wasn't getting it out. So that was the problem, a compound problem. You got the cockpit drain hose and the failing bilge pump. So it felt out of control, but I ask you this, was God ever out of control in that? He wasn't. He can't be out of control. He's God. Was he cruel to let that happen to us? Was he being mean, toying with us? No. Even though to allow this was a negative thing, it was a necessary thing, because if that bilge pump had worked, we would have never known about the hole in the cockpit drain hose, because it just would have taken the water out of the boat. But who knows what would have happened if we were several miles offshore and the bilge pump failed. I mean, we really would have been in dire straits at that point. So that experience worked to inform us. God was, in essence, preparing us to deal with a problem that we never knew existed. So I look back on that now. I mean, even though we had, several weeks of the heebie-jeebies every time we headed out, we're like traumatized. Everybody's looking at the bilge light, making sure it's not on. But I see that as a picture of God's faithfulness, because he had us. He had us all along. Felt like he didn't, felt like it might end up with a really sweet gift from him, our beloved sailboat being at the bottom of the lake. And if God had told us this was going to happen, of course I would have found a million reasons why he should pick some other sailor to let this happen to. So I'm glad I didn't know. And I'm sure you guys, all of us, have stories like that, right? Where something devastating happened, and yet God proved himself faithful to you through it. And the truth is, we don't know what's coming at us every day. Anything could happen every day. We're not in control. We don't know the future. But God does, and he's faithful, and we're on a journey. And whatever is happening in your life right now, he's preparing you for what's next. I promise you, it's useful, even though sometimes it hurts, and we'll get around to how he uses those things in a little bit. And Exodus is going to deliver, see what I did there? A picture of what it looks like to trust God with impossible things. And there's already been so many impossible things in this story. I mean, when Brooke Ann was teaching last week, we saw Moses being put in the Nile. I mean, how desperate can a mother be to put her baby in a basket and sit him in the Nile, exposing him to all the elements, exposing him to all the creatures in the Nile that would maybe have him as a snack? And then his sister follows him. He's rescued by a princess, returned to his mother so she can be his wet nurse. And all of this, God was preparing a way for Moses to later free the Hebrew people. And I want you to notice something in the story. Because Pharaoh was out to destroy all the males, because the men, were a threat to him, right? Because they can join the army and fight him. He had no fear of females. He saw them as property. But look at the females in the story. He considered them to be of no threat to him, and yet they really kind of wrecked his plan. I mean, at the beginning of Exodus, we see the story of the midwives. And they refused to obey Pharaoh's destructive plan to kill the infant boys, and they risked their lives to spare the lives of the Hebrew people. And we'll come back to this later, but for now, just kind of let that roll around in your mind while we're going through this, and ask yourself, why did God start Exodus with that? Why would that be the beginning and not just Moses in the Nile, right? But for now, we're going to start reading the beginning of our text today, and I'm probably going to scan and skip a little bit because for the sake of time. So, Exodus 2, beginning in verses 11 through 15, says, "One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And then when he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, 'Why do you strike your companion?' And he answered, 'Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me too, like you killed the Egyptian?' And then Moses was afraid and thought, 'Oh, surely the thing is known.' And then when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian and sat down," or as the word really means, he dwelled by a well. So Moses is about 40 years old. He's middle-aged. The text says he looked down on their burdens. So right there, God is beginning. He's planting that seed of compassion for the Hebrew people in Moses. He's preparing him to rescue them. But it wasn't going to happen for a while. So he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he intervenes. He had a sense and a desire already to rescue them. So he's intervening, but he's doing it in his own strength. So God was already preparing his heart, but the thing is, it wasn't time. I mean, how many times have we had a burden and we go and solve it? We don't even ask God, is it time yet? We have to really follow his timing. Moses jumped the gun. And the next day, 2 Hebrews are fighting each other, and he tries to break it up, and they ask him, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us?" And what's a little shocking here is that Moses was a Hebrew himself. You would think they would have appreciated his intervention, but they didn't. Because even though he was one of their own people, the Hebrews did not recognize him as a deliverer yet. So right here is a little parallel. Do you see it? Because in John 1:11, it says of Jesus, he came to his own, and his own received him not. So here Moses isn't being recognized as a deliverer, just like Jesus later would not be recognized as the Messiah. Jesus is our Moses. And here's another little parallel. At the end of that last passage, it mentions that Moses sits down by a well, dwells by a well. So we'll read on from there. Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. When they came home to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come home so soon today?" And they said, "An Egyptian." They don't recognize him. They think he's an Egyptian. He's a Hebrew. "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock." So he says to his daughters, "Then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread." And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and the man gave Moses his daughter Zipporah, and she gave birth to a son. And he called his name Gershom, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." So we'll talk a little bit about wells here. Wells in the Bible were places of promise. It's symbolic of places of promises. Men would find women and betroth themselves at a well. Abraham's servant found Rebekah at a well. Jacob and Rachel met at a well. Who else? Do you see the parallel here? Who else met a woman at the well? Exactly, Jesus. And the questions he answered, or he asked her, had to do with who she was married to or who she was betrothed to. That woman went through man after man after man after man after man, 5 men, looking for true love, looking for the true bridegroom. And here Jesus comes, and she's meeting the true bridegroom. And he promises her living water that she would never thirst again. And here in Exodus 2, Moses winds up marrying Zipporah and having a son named Gershom, which means sojourner. The name reflects the circumstances of Moses' life at the time, as often they would do when they named children back then. So the parallel I want you to notice here is that we too are sojourners. The Bible calls us aliens and strangers for a reason, because we're not home yet. It's so easy to get caught up here and invest in this life so much that we forget that this is only, we see this life as this big, when in reality, in the light of eternity, this life is millimeters. It's just a vapor. Sometimes we try to make our promised land here, but it's not. We're sojourners here until we arrive there. Again, Jesus is our Moses. He said he's preparing a place for us, and we can trust that here in this life, he's preparing us for that place. So moving on in verse 23, during those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Don't you love that? He knows what you're going through, and he's not surprised by it. So the king who sought to kill Moses is now dead. That old Pharaoh is gone. Now there's a new Pharaoh. And all this time, what's happening back in Egypt? They're still slaves all that time. And they're groaning, as Brooke Ann mentioned last week. They're, about time. It took them a long time to groan and cry out to God. But finally, they groaned and they cried out to God for rescue. And don't you just kind of feel that with them? Aren't you crying out for rescue when you look at our world today? I mean, there's a lot of beauty here, but there's a lot of struggle too. It's just a mess. So we're groaning too. In Romans 8, it says, we know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. So we are waiting for him, and he is waiting for us. One day the Lord's going to say, go get her, go get my bride, and he's going to break through those clouds, and we're all going to be caught up with him. It's going to be amazing. And here in Exodus, the people are groaning and crying out, and we read that God sees, he hears, he knows. So what happens next? Chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And from the homework this week, what's another name for Mount Horeb? Sinai. Wow, good job. That was a lot of people. It's Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is the place they're going to come to when they've left Egypt, and God is going to give Moses the 10 Commandments for them on Mount Sinai. So here he is, ironically, leading a flock of sheep of his father-in-law Jethro. He's leading that flock of sheep to Mount Sinai, when later he's going to actually be leading God's flock of Israelites to Mount Sinai. Verses 2 through 6, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, but it was not consumed. And Moses said, I'll turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off, for the place you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So don't let the familiarity of this story make you numb to it. I mean, as Brooke Ann said last week, pretend you don't know the end. I mean, think about that. If you guys go home today and there's a bush on fire in the front of your house and it's not burning up, wouldn't that give you pause? Like, wouldn't you be like, what is happening? You know, that fire was God. That fire was God. And he was calling to Moses out of it by name. And Moses hides his face because he understands the contrast of how holy God is and how holy he isn't. I mean, what would you do if Jesus just walked right up here right now? Wouldn't we all feel like, oh my gosh, ooh, let's see, what did I say when I stubbed my toe yesterday? Oh, that wasn't good. I mean, we would all see the contrast of how holy he is and how holy we're not. Why did God tell him to take his sandals off? Think about that. Genesis 3:19 says that we all come from dust and we will all return to dust. So what connects us to the dust? Where are your feet right now? They're connected to the ground. They're connected to the dust. So in this instance, it symbolizes to take your sandals off means humble yourself. You're standing on holy ground. It's a recognition that you come from dust. You are the created, not the creator. So God is emphasizing that. He's preparing Moses through humility. I mean, imagine the different shoes that Moses wore in his lifetime. The posh slippers of a prince, and then the sandals of a shepherd. And now here he is in bare feet. And he's doing the same with us. He's always reminding us that he's in control and he's got us. He's preparing us by humbling us sometimes. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing. So moving on in verse 7 rather. Then the Lord said, and listen to how many times he says, I, just like Janelle read this morning, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land to a good and a broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, and all the otherites. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come up to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. I mean, in verse 8, I have come down to deliver them. He's delivering them to what? A broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, what does that sound like? That reminds me of something that happened before. Doesn't it sound like Eden? So this is a statement of promise. It's a promise of restoration between God and his people. He's going to bring it back to the way it should have been all along. But they have to be delivered first. And the word Egypt, by the way, it means cramped, tight, and narrow. Have you ever been between a rock and a hard place? Have you ever been in a tight spot? He is preparing us to be delivered through the tight spots. And when we get to heaven, that's going to be our land flowing with milk and honey in a broad land. It's interesting that God uses that broad land to contrast the land of Egypt. So watch what Moses done in what he does in verse 11. But Moses says to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" He said, "But I will be with you, and this will be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will serve God on this mountain." And moving on to verse 13, then Moses says to God, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What's his name?' what am I going to say?" So what is Moses doing? I mean, first of all, he's doing the same thing we all do when God lays something on our heart. Well, I'm not smart enough. I'm not popular enough. I'm not talented enough. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not enough. That's what we do. So he's probably terrified because he knows they're not going to, he's going by history. They never listened to him then. Why would they listen to him now? But he's also asking God for his name. He's asking God for credibility. He's asking for security, in essence. He wants to know they're going to listen to him because hopefully knowing God's name will cause them to listen to God and to listen to Moses. And God says to Moses, "I am who I am," in verse 14. And he says, "Say this to the people of Israel, 'I am has sent me to you.'" And Moses is probably thinking, "Really? I am? That's your name?" But think about that name, because that name is something that no human could have, really, because I am is present tense for all of time. It doesn't have a beginning. It doesn't have an end. I mean, we could say, "I am for now." We're not eternal. Well, we are eternal, but it didn't start with us. It started with the great I am. So only God can say that. The name highlights that everything begins and ends with God's intention. All of creation is suspended by God's will. He's the origin of everything. This is the only name for God. And it also means that God is never unprepared. So he's preparing us, and he can do that because he's never unprepared. Verse 15, God also said to Moses, "Say this to the people of Israel. 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt, and I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites and the Otherites, a land flowing with milk and honey.'" Now, why does God list the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Canaanites, the Amorites, all of the ites? Why does he mention them so many times? Because he was letting them know that he knows. He knows their enemies, and ultimately he's preparing them to take the land back from those enemies. Just like he's preparing us to take back ground from our enemy. Verse 18, "And they will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel will go to the king of Egypt and say to him, 'The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now please let us go a 3-day journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God.'" So here's God telling Moses that the Israelites are going to listen to him, which is already a stretch because they didn't recognize him before. They didn't receive him. But God is setting a clear expectation for Moses because he's actually telling him the future. He is telling him what's going to happen in order to get Moses to trust him. I mean, this right here, this tells you the future. God gives us this so that we will trust him. When everything looks grim, when the storms are raging, we can read this, we can know our ultimate future is good, and we will get through it all. And one day we will understand it all, and it'll make perfect sense. And then God goes a step further in verse 19. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. And after that, he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you won't go empty-handed. But each woman will ask of her neighbor and any woman who lives in her house for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. And you will put them on your sons and daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians. Isn't that a turn of events? Now, why is God promising plunder? I mean, is he just giving them, money for the vacation? Is this some sort of timeshare? Winning lottery ticket? How does the plunder prepare them? Do you remember later in the story what they do when they come out of Egypt? Ultimately, they build the tabernacle. That plunder is God's provision ahead of time so that they will have all the materials they need to build the tabernacle. Do you see how he's preparing them? Do you trust that he's preparing you? And they were granted favor and abundance and provision, just like we are. We don't just get delivered from death to life, we get an abundant life. We too are being prepared to take down our enemies and to enter the promised land ourselves. Here again, Jesus is our Moses. So you remember the question that I told you to roll around in your head? Why did it start with the midwives? Why not just start with Moses in the Nile? Think about what they did. The midwives refused to cooperate with an evil plan. They feared God more than they feared death. The midwives delivered the babies from the evil intentions of the enemy, Pharaoh, by sparing their lives. This was foreshadowing our deliverer. Jesus is our midwife. He knew you before you were born. And then you were born again. He delivered you. Jesus is our midwife. Because he did that same thing. He didn't fear death. He didn't give in to temptation to preserve his own life. But he gave it up to spare ours, to deliver us safely. So I'm going to do a little quick recap here so we can really meditate on the symbolism and the foreshadowings and the parallels in this story. God is preparing a place for us. And everything we experience here is preparing us for that place. And if you believe that, you can go through whatever you're going through right now. I can go through the storm I'm going through right now with hope and confidence and expectation that I'll get through it, rather than doubt and fear and doom. And you might not understand it this side of heaven. Sometimes he reveals to us the reasons for things here, but sometimes he doesn't. And that's where faith comes in. because you can know and be confident that you will know the story. You will know why that happened. The losses you've had, the struggles you've had, the betrayals that have happened in your life, it will make sense one day. You will get the answer, but we have to wait. I know wait is a 4-letter word, but we have to wait. Secondly, the only way to serve God is like Moses did with the burning bush, with bare feet. Bare feet symbolizes 100% honesty. Because guess who the burning bush is now? It's you. It's me. Because we have the Spirit of God in us. He's the fire. And we're not consumed. He's the great I am. So we serve him with bare feet and a keen awareness of who we are, where we came from, waiting for his instruction, connected to that he is the creator and we are the created, waiting for his timing, no pretense. Thirdly, God hears your groaning. He hears your groaning. He hears your cries. Trust me. He knows your burdens. He sees you. He hears you. He cares. Believe this. God is not a bully. He's preparing you for what's next. He knows what that is. We don't. So we have to trust him. And lastly, we're only sojourners here. This is not our home. We're going somewhere. We're going to the promised land, and God will be faithful to deliver us there intact if we follow him and trust him. Don't accept Egypt when Canaan is your destination. Don't invest too much here. Invest there. And what investing there looks like is you're going to take with you the only thing you can, which are human souls. The human souls that you love and care for and reach for Jesus are the things we can take with us to the promised land. It's really easy to get comfortable here and focused on our lives, and there's a lot of beauty, but there's a lot of suffering too. And you need to know this is our wilderness in a way. It's our wilderness. This is our desert. The Israelites wandered an awfully long time in the desert because they didn't get the lesson. They had to get the lesson before they could enter the promised land. Make sure you're watching for what God is teaching you through it. How long will we wander? See, we're born into sin. And by that, I don't mean necessarily sinful actions, but we're born into a sinful mindset. Why? What does that look like? It looks like what Eve did in the garden. She decided on her own. Oh, that looks good. Yeah, God said that, but I trust me more. Looks good, tastes good, smells good. We trust ourselves over God. We become self-reliant. We rely on ourselves to get us through things. And the only way God can free us from that prison, which most of the time we don't even know exists, is to peel back our comfort zone. Everything you rely on is standing between you and God if it's not him. He allows our idols to fail us because he's merciful and gracious. He's conforming us to the image of his son, Jesus. This is why Paul says to count it all joy when you fall into various trials, because it conforms you into the image of his son, and that is the best version of yourself that you will ever be when you are surrendered fully and you allow Jesus to shine through you. So don't think God is a bully. Don't think he's being mean. if you're going through tough things right now. Believe with hope and expectation that he's leading you to the promised land. I'm going to pray for us. Heavenly Father, thank you so much that you are in charge. Thank you for the grace you give. Thank you for the trials. Thank you for the pain. Help us to conform to the image of your Son. We trust you. We love you. We know the promised land is ahead. Help us grab the hands of people beside us on the journey and bring them to you too. Thank you for loving us. Thank you that you never forsake us or leave us. In Jesus' name, amen.